Carrie, you're very welcome to the studio today. Thank you so much for joining myself and Nick, and we're really looking forward to diving into talking about lots of legal issues.
Right, thanks guys. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So Carrie, can you just talk to us a little bit about your work as a solicitor and what services you provide?
Of course. So I'm showing my age, but I'm a solicitor for nearly 25 years, which kind of scares me. I set up MDM Solicitors in Cork in 2016, probably because I wanted to offer a bespoke service to clients, a more personal service. I'd previously been with a very large firm, a really, really great firm, but I was committed to that connection, that relationship piece. So I set up on Washington Street originally in 2016, and then slowly but surely we grew, and it's been a great journey. And we opened on Dawson Street in Dublin last year, which is just probably my ultimate dream.
Amazing.
We offer lots of different legal services. We have a private client team that look after conveyancing, wills, trusts, divorce, separation and employee matters. We have an insurance team that looks after defence litigation, and we have a banking team that looks after some of the banking requirements from some of the larger institutions. We also have a medical negligence team that looks after anybody who needs advice around medical negligence. And we also offer a HR and risk service to small and medium-sized businesses who need to conform with legislation from a compliance and regulatory perspective. So quite a wide-reaching,
huge range
service, base. So and it's been brilliant. It's been amazing, and I'd like to think that we're still in the creative phase, that we're not in any way near the end. So we want to keep adding and growing. And
do you have clients around the country?
Yeah, nationally, and also I act for a lot of UK-based clients. So get to go to interesting places at times, which is fantastic.
Very good. And I think, I suppose sometimes when people come for financial planning, there are a lot of legal aspects as well to, consultations. And one particular thing that has come up quite frequently, Carrie, is people seeking advice on wills. So can you talk to me just very basically, I suppose, about what a will is and why somebody in Ireland should have one?
Okay, so a will is a legal document that sets out your instructions that are to apply when you die in terms of your assets. I suppose there are two ways the law views death. One is where somebody dies with a will, they die testate, and where someone dies without a will, they die intestate. Intestacy is somewhat chaotic. It means the estate of that person takes a much longer time to distribute. And so we would always, as lawyers, advise somebody to have a will. I suppose when we see people making their first will, it will be really when they purchase a property, because with that property comes decisions and thoughts about what happens if I die. In particular, if you're purchasing a property with another person, we will be looking at the structure of the ownership, and we will be mentioning, in the event of someone's untimely death, what happens their share of that property. So with that first purchase, we would always advise parties to make a will. Again, some of those advices will be premised around cohabitation and or marriage, as those aspects will affect the advice that's given. It's very tailored to the individual or the individual couple. It's very much probably like financial planning. There isn't one rule that fits all, but you have to sort of look at the person's circumstances, their lives, and advise them best on what their will should be.
What I find, Carrie, is that when I'm dealing with clients and advise them to have a will made, it's part of the financial planning review that we go through with them. I find a lot of them tend to kind of steer away thinking that there's a lot involved and there's costs, which they're not really sure about what the cost implications are, but also having their estate kind of lined up. Is there anything that you would say to individuals in terms of just getting the will made?
I guess nobody really likes talking about death. I mean, I think even, within the profession of lawyers, we hate even making our own wills because it forces you to sort of think about something you don't want to think about. The cost is very minimal in terms of making a will, but it is a very important document, and the legal drafting of it is complex and has to be correct. So it can take a couple of meetings before it's correct. And it's important that as a solicitor, when you're taking instructions to draft somebody's will, that you meet with them and you have an understanding of exactly what their circumstances are, what their obligations are, and to who they wish to make their bequests. Sometimes in more larger estate planning, you'll require a tax advisor to become involved, which might consider aspects such as trusts if there are larger assets, or, share assets and children. And so it's probably what I said earlier. It's not one size fits all. You have to definitely engage in a process with that client to understand their needs, to understand their assets, and then to provide them with the best advice you can. And in some instances, that may require some tax support as well. And again, all very simple to do once somebody is prepared to give their time. In terms of the cost of drafting it, very minimal. It's not an expensive process.
And we're all living in a fast-paced world. Can this be done virtually, or does somebody need to come into the office and do it in person?
No, it certainly can be done virtually. I mean, we do online consultations with clients now 90% of the time. I always prefer to meet somebody face-to-face, but where that's not something that can be achieved, it's not a difficulty to do it. However, when the will is being signed, the person has to come in to sign it in the presence of the solicitor witness. That can't be done, virtually and sent back in the post. So that is one requirement. There has to be an execution meeting.
You mentioned, Carrie, about when you buy a house is a sort of an opportune time to make a will. Are there any other events that you would suggest?
So if a person makes a will in advance of being married, the marriage itself invalidates the will. So you have to advise somebody, if they marry, they need to engage in the process again. And it's very important people understand that, because a marriage in itself for the spouse creates rights over property assets, and the spouse has an automatic right to a percentage of an estate of their spouse. So it automatically invalidates that will. So a new will is required then.
We were talking, I suppose, off air earlier, unfortunately, and this is the reality of life, that 1 in 2 marriages are breaking down. In terms of separation, and I know we'll touch on that in a minute, but does separation invalidate your will, or is it just another marriage?
No, so separation and divorce don't invalidate an existing will, but generally when we advise parties who are separating or divorcing about succession, within the divorce, we prevent the spouse obtaining rights over someone's estate. I probably think that on divorce, a new will should certainly be in the contemplation of the party divorcing, just for clarification. And a will is probably like a financial plan. As you go through various stages of your life, you should probably certainly consider updating it, because you acquire more assets or more obligations, such as you have children. And so it's not necessarily something a person should just do once. It's something that they should contemplate doing throughout the ages and stages of their life.
And one thing I'm seeing more commonly, Carrie, being spoken about is the enduring power of attorney. Can you just explain briefly what that is and why it's relevant to people?
So an enduring power of attorney is a document that gives somebody close to you who you trust the right to make financial and somewhat physical decisions in the event that you have not got capacity to make them. It's become important because there is some new assisted decision-making legislation. There's new assisted decision-making legislation in being, which again means that if you become incapacitated and you don't have an enduring power of attorney, the process is complicated in terms of how your estate and your affairs will be managed. And I suppose particularly for anyone, who would require assistance going forward, an enduring power of attorney is something you would certainly recommend, to allow the family to support that vulnerable person. Again, you are advising, that person to discuss their circumstances at length and putting together a document on their instruction to allow somebody else to make decisions for them in the event they become incapable.
And just in a practical sense, so like even for me personally, I'm 51, obviously married to Cliona.
Still looking well.
Is there kind of an age range that you suggest that people start to consider? Is it when you get a bit older and start having some elements that you start to think about this? Or is
I certainly think age is a factor. For example, my own mum is perfectly healthy and wonderful, but I certainly have advised her that she should have one in the event that she became incapable. And again, it's one of those conversations a bit like the will. Nobody likes having it, but it absolutely is a conversation that should be had. And particularly as vulnerable years approach, certainly I think so. And it's amazing, actually, very few people do it. It always strikes
Nobody
me.
likes thinking about that stage, I suppose, about a stage where you are going to be incapacitated and cannot, have function. But actually, having worked in the medical field for a long time, it was a geriatrician that I had a conversation with a long time ago, and he said he would really, really advocate for it because it gives people, well, it makes sense if somebody is incapacitated,
Yeah. I think as well the cost of doing it is they can be complicated, and it can be a little bit more expensive, say, than drafting a will. I mean, in a way, you'd wonder why the government haven't considered introducing supports around it for more vulnerable age groups, but unfortunately that's not there. But certainly it's a very advisable thing to do as older years approach.
And inheritance planning. So this is obviously another area that's very kind of closely linked with, I suppose, what Nick advises clients on in terms of planning for your children's future. Talk to us a little bit about how you advise people in the whole kind of estate and inheritance planning.
Well, I suppose if you look at the Succession Act and you consider the tax implications, and Nick would be a better place to advise on lots of this than me, you can give a child up to €400,000 either throughout life tax-free or on death. And anything over and above that then is taxed at the 33% rate. So you have lots of families who have to sell assets to pay the tax. And I suppose, you can consider a Section 72 policy. I mean, Nick, you'll know better than me. I believe they're expensive and people find that expense difficult to and a burden. And, ways around the taxation implications on death are always for larger earners and high net worth individuals, certainly things that should be contemplated and carefully. And again, throughout different ages and stages, because obviously life changes and people acquire more, they sometimes divest themselves of assets, or they give money throughout their life to their children to assist them. And again, every family, and I always say this, particularly in family law cases, when, somebody comes in for divorce or separation advice, they say, well, what's going to happen? And I always say, well, every family is different. So what works for family A doesn't work for family B. And it's the same with estate planning. There are lots of ways trusts, discretionary trusts can be used with good tax advice to support, estate planning. But we would always advise somebody to be engaging with a financial advisor and a tax planner with regard to all of that. Our role really as the solicitor, the person who's drafting the documentation, is to be steered by the financial advisor, the client and the tax advisor, and to draft the appropriate documentation to protect that person's estate going forward in line with those instructions. we would not consider ourselves experts at giving any level of estate planning advice outside of the norm.
And I think you're right, Carrie, because as you say, I'm meeting more and more people now that are starting to think a little bit more around the areas. And you mentioned Section 72, which is this life policy that you buy. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, it's too late when they start to think about it. And then obviously, given the age that they're at, possibly with, health ailments, they find it just prohibitively expensive. There are other ways and that we speak to them about just trying to, safeguard themselves, like the small gift exemption, for example, which I think is a very useful, powerful tool if used, way in advance. And it's about trying to combine a financial planner with a solicitor. And it kind of falls into even the area of business owners because, I meet a lot of business owners and obviously like yourself. And what I find is that they require tax advice, legal advice and financial planning advice. And unfortunately, sometimes they might get one aspect of it, but it's just trying to connect the dots. So for example, I talk to clients around, the area of shareholder protection. And, it's essentially just trying to ensure the value of a business. So, for example, Alpha Wealth, myself and Cliona are the shareholders. In the event of if there were other shareholders who were brought into the business, the financial implications of one of us passing, what would it mean for the others? And there's obviously a legal document that needs to kind of run alongside that. And it's just the fact that some people just don't get either around to it or don't realise that, they need to be used in conjunction with each other rather than just building up an asset or having a life policy that doesn't really satisfy the requirement, if that makes sense.
Yes, for sure. And I think it's a bit like when you start out in your working world. I always remember my late father saying, make sure you sign up for the pension. And I remember thinking, how do you spell pension? And, when you're 21 and you're talking about the word pension, you think, don't be ridiculous. I don't need that, and you're planning your Saturday night. And now at 45, all of a sudden the word pension means a great deal more to me than it did when I was 21. And I don't know where the intervening 24 years have gone. It's like a blink of an eye. So it's the same thing. And the thing I think is interesting is people avoid these words: will, pension, inheritance, tax planning. They avoid those words, okay, which are so important, and yet they work so hard to achieve. And yet they avoid making plans and putting time into making sure that A, there's going to be a good retirement, and B, that in the event of something untimely or unexpected happening, that they are protected, whether through enduring power of attorney or that their family is protected by way of will, and that they are not paying inordinate tax that they don't need to pay. And it's funny because, as you said, touched on earlier, we're all so busy and everything is going at this crazy speed. We're booking restaurants for a month in advance to make sure we get in. Yet when you sit down and have a conversation like this, you realise how little time or little priority we give things that are actually really important. And for me, and individually for me, personally, like I sort of think every year I should talk to my financial advisor and go through, this year looks like this and what should I do? And and that makes perfect sense. And for me, as I get older, the important thing is to prioritize those things more than booking the restaurant for a month's time, because it's now more important than ever.
100%. And I suppose when I'm listening to you, Carrie, and you've touched on a few things, and one of the things, I suppose, and it's been pertinent to both Nick and I, is separation. And actually, we've been asked by one of the papers to write...
You're newlyweds, guys, really.
to write an article on what couples, or what someone, should do in the event that they're facing a separation. So from a legal perspective, what would you advise?
I think marital breakdown is one of the hardest things anybody will face in life. And I'm not even going to say more particularly when there's children, because I think it is just awful no matter what your circumstances are. I don't think anybody gets into a relationship and marries somebody lightly. And I think when that falls apart, it's incredibly difficult and it can be very scary. So again, there are no two cases the same. And there are never situations I come across where I say, well, I had the same thing last year, so this is what's going to happen, because every relationship and every family is different. I think the first thing is, and I always say this, if you can take advice in advance of the actual breakdown of the marriage and decisions being made around that, that's always better, because you are dealing with the breakdown in an informed way. And so I much prefer to meet a client who hasn't separated, and then give them advice around their decision and how best to progress that decision, rather than somebody who's made lots of decisions that mightn't necessarily be good decisions in the cold light of day. And this is such an emotional state you're in. Your decision making is somewhat impacted in any case, and that's where the objectivity of a good advisor comes in. So that's the first part.
Yeah.
The second part is that divorce and separation in Ireland is pretty much no fault now. So it really, and not in all cases, but in many cases, is irrelevant what led to the breakdown of the relationship. And I think sometimes people in that process are angry and they want to blame. And what we're trying to support them to do is to get to a place where they see objectively that blame is really not going to assist them. And then we deal with the remaining life afterwards in the best possible way.
And I suppose it can be financially very scary for people. I mean, separation has the emotional side, it has the financial aspect. You know, there's just so many different aspects to a couple separating.
Sure. And I think, you know, you touched on, both of you having gone through that process, and I'm sure if you look back, you'll see the road or the journey you've travelled. And our job is to provide advice around the financials and around the maintenance and access where there are children, to get couples progressed to a new journey of living separately, but co-parenting and, you know, separating finances. And it's hard. It's very, very hard for lots of people.
And how long does it necessarily take for, you know, anyone, I suppose, because I know that Nick meets a lot of maybe a lot of people that are maybe in that stage and haven't actually kind of formally engaged with the solicitor. So, you know, how long, or is it different for everybody?
It is absolutely different for everyone, because an awful lot depends on the journey and what brought, you know, for example, if one person wants to separate and another doesn't, that can be a very hard process and often longer. Where there are third parties involved, that can be a complex process for the party who doesn't want to end the marriage. So, and then sometimes you have two people who make a decision and they're both in an emotional place where they just are ready to move on. And it really does depend. If there are children and parents are co-parenting, you know, obviously that creates additional requirements in terms of advice, and that can elongate matters. Our job, though, and I think the law got this wrong for a long time, and it's something I have disliked hugely. Our job is to support parties in the process, not to make it worse or inflammatory. And our commitment to our clients is always to try and support them, identify what's fair, and try and achieve a fairness, so that the journey is made that little bit easier. And that's certainly what we would try and do. But it is a very difficult, you know, it is by far the most difficult advice we give, because the person coming in is generally vulnerable. I think sometimes it's sort of like advising employers who are, facing unfair dismissal claims, and that is something that we're seeing on the rise. And they feel very emotional about that because they've, looked after an employee and there's been some level of a dispute and now they're being litigated against, and they find that very difficult. And sometimes those consultations will remind me a little bit of family law consultations where, you're dealing with hurt.
Yeah, again, it's two people are entering into a contract at the beginning of, and it brings us kind of onto the next topic. And I don't mean to be kind of moving from, because it's going from something that's very emotional, but redundancy, Carrie, is something that we're seeing an awful lot. And again, there can be a lot of emotions, a lot of high emotions when somebody gets, notice from an employer that they're being made redundant. Do you deal with people in that capacity and in that regard?
Of course. I mean, we would provide employment advices to both employers and employees in those situations. I would say from the employer perspective, lots of small and medium businesses in Ireland operating without any HR policies. And HR is such a big part of any business. Even if you have one employee who is your niece, who you think, she's my niece, so I don't need to worry about it, you absolutely do. The law is very clear. Every employee must have a contract. Your business should have an office manual. Your business should have a grievance procedure. Your business should have a policy about sick pay, annual leave. There are so many businesses who just, again, for time or cost, reasons, don't invest in these things. And as a result, it can be very expensive when it goes wrong. To go back to the employee who's made redundant, of course, we will always provide advice around that. Generally, again, it's very bespoke advice because it depends on the circumstances applicable to the individual employee. You're looking at, is the redundancy fair? Is the process fair? Has the person been selected fairly? Mm-hmm. And then you're advising them around the financial implications. And again, sometimes we refer that person for financial advice or tax advice around that package, depending on the package.
Well, they're
itself.
just also interlinked.
Yeah, and just in terms of the HR services, Carrie, because again, we deal with a lot of smaller, medium-sized businesses. What exactly would you provide them?
Well, we would always look at somebody's business needs, and then we would identify areas of weakness. So if they have employees without contracts, we would advise them to make sure that everybody has a contract. We would give them advisory advice around those contracts. We would talk to them about what policies are required, what staff manuals they need to make sure that they're in compliance with the legislation. And so many, again, a bit like the wills and the pensions and the estate planning, they just think, sure, I don't need that. I only have 5 or 6 people. No big deal.
And like auto-enrollment, Carrie, another big area for employers where contracts will need to probably be amended.
So auto-enrollment, I suppose, just for those who don't know what it is, it means that from the 1st of January 2026, I believe is the new date, that everybody in Ireland has to have a pension. So anybody employed who doesn't have a private pension will be auto-enrolled and have a state pension. And the default is you're opted in and you must opt out if you don't want it. It really is good news for society because it means that as people become older, that they will have put a certain percentage of their salary throughout their working life away. And then that will be available to them. For the employer, it's not such a good news story because, well, firstly, you have to contribute a percentage of the person's salary to the pension pot. But it is a payroll exercise that the employer will have to go through. I think for all small and medium-sized businesses, the recommendation certainly seems to be that they have private pensions. And that allows the employer to protect its contribution for a certain length of time. With the state auto-enrolment, if the person works for 6 months and then decides to leave employment, the employer has no right to a refund of that money currently. And so, for small businesses, that's difficult. And also, even the management of it from a payroll perspective is difficult. Whereas I think if a private pension is available, it's an easier option. You will have some employers who will have to do both, which will be, I think, a difficult payroll exercise. So it's an additional cost for businesses for sure.
And
A
again, Carrie,
necessary one for society, I think, Nick.
just you're right, and like we're seeing this that I suppose officially on the 1st of July this year, that's the 6-month period before obviously auto enrolment kicks in January. There's a situation for employers. So, for example, even Alpha Wealth, where if we hire somebody in August or September, they can't be put on the 6-month mandatory probation before their pension kicks in, because obviously the 1st of January they must be in a pension scheme or they'll be auto enrolled. And I think that's something that even for large businesses, they need to be mindful of. And what we're trying to do is just to educate them and say, you need to be mindful of trying to implement your staff into the current pension arrangement, or be mindful that there is a scenario. And then you've got the implication of the lower rate and then the higher rate taxpayers. So auto enrollment absolutely doesn't suit anyone who's on the high rate of tax. And we keep saying this, that if you're earning over the standard, typically 44,000 a year in Ireland, you really want to try and avoid auto enrollment like the plague. You're going to lose out on tax relief. It's quite a rigid scheme, and it doesn't allow you to make those accelerated contributions, which the employee may want to make. So there's a lot of moving parts, and I think people are still getting used to this, and the government, and it's following the model, obviously, auto enrolment from the UK, which is quite advanced at this stage. It's been in place for over 10 years now, and other countries like Australia, and they had teething issues for a number of years, certainly in the early stage. And I think we're going to see that, and it's going to probably lead to legal implications, but also, again, like you said earlier about, not leaving these things to one side. And I think it's just that, again, for a lot of businesses that are like Alpha Wealth, for example, we have 14 employees now. We've grown, slowly over the years, and we've not necessarily, embraced the different aspects of what is involved. HR has been a function that we've had to grow, compliance, dealing with other aspects like, again, okay, we're in the industry, but dealing with pensions for staff, it's not something that some employers want to get too ingrained with. And then there's even implications of having part-time employees that if they have another employment elsewhere, that in itself can cause implications for that particular employer, and they might not even realise. So I think there's going to be a lot of things, as you said, going on, but it really is important to get advice.
I'm just thinking, sorry, we've kind of touched on, obviously, wills, estate planning, separation, divorce, redundancy. But one thing that, and I think you probably may see a lot of it as well, Carrie, is personal injuries in terms of claims and everything like that. Is this an area that you deal with?
Sure. So we do, of course. It's probably our largest aspect of what the firm does. So we do lots of personal injury work, medical negligence claims. And yeah, sure. I mean, you get lots of people put in very vulnerable positions as a result of accidents that occur, or and people who can no longer work and provide for themselves, and some very, very difficult things happen when somebody is injured. And again, that person is then therefore vulnerable. And so, you're trying to fight to get them the best result, because, as I always say to somebody in that scenario, you have one chance. And again, often they get settlements that need the expertise of somebody advising them financially how to manage, particularly in scenarios where they're unable to work, or they're unable to work at the capacity they used to work, or their life continues to be affected by pain or, whatever ailment it is that has they have sustained. So in those scenarios, it's particularly important.
And that's again, I suppose, where, income protection is another thing, obviously, that you would talk to a lot of individuals about. But when you mention it, it just, like when somebody cannot earn and doesn't have the capacity to earn any longer, it's frightening.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, Nick, I don't know about you, but for me, I could tell you on both hands how many people I've ever met with income protection. I mean, it's the most undersold thing. And again, is it that the cost is prohibitory in many cases, or?
I think, and you're right, Carrie, it's completely undersold in Ireland. The main reason why I feel people don't have income protection is that they think that their employer is going to look after them. And in some cases, there is some cover, but the problem is that sometimes it's not sufficient. And obviously, if that person leaves that employment, then they find themselves vulnerable at a stage probably where it becomes quite prohibitively expensive, because obviously if they're in their sort of 40s and 50s, particularly with medical ailments, a lot of it is that it's the financial services industry. We push pensions, we push savings products because they are more exciting and they're, what we call these living benefits, whereas things like, serious illness cover, income protection, even life cover to a degree, people just don't want to
It
think
might
about.
never happen.
Might never happen.
Yeah.
I mean, for a self-employed person, though, income protection, it
essential.
has to be essential.
Absolutely. But again, they see it as a cost and something that they probably put towards the back burner.
But correct me if I'm wrong, a tax-deductible cost?
It is a tax deductible cost,
so
So you get
effectively
40%,
it's almost free.
50%
50%.
saving, yeah, absolutely. But again,
Probably a little bit misunderstood as well. And it's a good thing, to point out, because
yeah, I mean,
it's not until something happens. And, I've seen many people that are self-employed going on a skiing holiday, come back with an injury, out of work for 6 to 8 weeks at a minimum, if not longer. And again, you're looking at something from where you're hoping that you have like day one income protection, or is that what they call it?
Absolutely. And the fact is that I think we've just seen that there's been so many things over the last number of years. We've seen the cost of living rise, we've seen wage increase costs. Obviously,
difficult.
it's challenging. And I think, again, it's an education piece, but it's something that we definitely recommend that people get advice on and guidance on. But like that, it's bringing that to the forefront, and that's sort of part of
And
what we're trying to do.
lastly, sorry, and I don't mean to interrupt you, Nick, but for anyone that's looking to buy a property, Carrie, is this a service that you offer also in terms of conveyancing?
Yes.
Or selling a property? Yeah.
We do, and we've just started actually adding conveyancing to the services that we offer. It is, and it's funny because the market is insane everywhere. Actually met a client yesterday who I purchased a property for 3 years ago, and she's selling it, and she is buying something else, but it's increased in value by 220,000, and I was sort of saying, wow. Yes. So that is something we do. I think there's particular focus over the last 12 months in kind of reaching out to first-time buyers. We've worked at some of the banks to give discounts on first-time buyer conveyancing. Again, it's a terrifying process for the first-time buyer. They are full of enthusiasm, but full of fear about what's ahead of them. And it's about supporting them through that process. And again, we would always make that wills advisory piece part of that process for the first-time buyer. And again, it's lovely for us to meet someone who's a first-time buyer because they tend to remain with the firm, and it's a new journey for us. It's a new relationship, and it's a great relationship generally. You're part of a process that's an enjoyable one, albeit scary. And of course, we do sales. We act for vendors who are selling properties all of the time.
And I think even in the news currently with the rent pressure zone, I think, it's really topical, and whether there'll be a lot of landlords that may sell up as a result, who knows?
Yeah, I think, again, a necessary step for society, but difficult for anybody who has invested in property over the years. Certainly, my personal view is that having a residential investment property is probably not a smart investment. Maybe 10 years ago, Nick, or 15 years ago, maybe it was a good investment. And now it just seems like
a lot of small landlords are getting out of the investment property market because the challenges ahead. Obviously, the government are putting pressure on them. And the fact is property values are quite high. So they're basically cashing in and they're worried about, the implications for tenancy rights, for example. But I think, Carrie, in terms of the way that, I see your business, and it's not dissimilar to ours, it's a little bit more personalised, more bespoke, rather than because there's a lot of, obviously, solicitor firms that provide conveyancing, but I found myself, because having bought property in the past, it's getting that little bit more specialised advice around, even just the deeds of the property, and there's a little bit more to it than just trying to get the cheapest cost, for example, which, people look at that and maybe it's a bigger factor perhaps than the other aspect, which is, as you said, even implementing things like wills, which I wouldn't even have considered, to be honest.
I think your relationship with your legal advisor should be one where you feel confident and you trust them. Okay, and that's important. And therefore, any relationship that's based on trust and confidence, the price should be competitive, but it should never be the deciding factor. You want to engage with somebody, probably like a financial advisor, who you feel, this person has my back. And we would see that as our job, to represent our clients and to bring them on whatever journey it is they choose to go on with the best support and advice. And then that's an informed journey. And I suspect it's quite like what you do. There's no one size that fits all, because everybody's position is different. And then you're providing them with, a bespoke service for them that suits them and that creates that sense of confidence in their decisions.
And how can somebody, obviously you've offices in Cork and Dublin, how can somebody engage with you, Carrie?
I always say pick up the phone and call us and make an appointment for a consultation. There are 16 of us, so there is, a wealth of experience in the office. We tend to kind of have a chat with somebody as to what they're looking for, and almost like a triage, and then point them in the best direction. We like to think that they get that personal service where they feel looked after, and there's a relationship of trust and confidence. That's very important to me. I would always say to somebody, if you don't feel that relationship with somebody, you're not with the right person, whether it be a financial advisor or a hairdresser or a lawyer or a doctor even. You have to feel that sense of trust and connection.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes beyond the actual service. It's actually feeling, there's a feeling there, and
you don't get it on an app.
Absolutely not. But look, I think the thing is, for anybody that is looking to engage with you, Carrie, and your offices, they can find you online as well, just as a first port of call. So thank you so much. I think we've covered a huge range of topics there, and I would encourage anyone that is looking for further legal advice to reach out to you directly.
Thank you so much. And we're MDM Solicitors, and you'll find us online. Thank you so much, guys. That was so interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really good. Thanks, Carrie.